Hello, and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with. I'm delighted to have with me Kevin Annett, who is a Canadian author. He's written an amazing 28 books so far, including Crimes Against Humanity in Canada, The Evidence. So he's a guy who knows a lot about the history of the church and many abuses that the Catholic Church has done across the world, including Canada in particular. And he also knows quite a lot about common law as well. But I'm going to hand you over to him to give a brief introduction about who he is and what he does. Thank you for coming on, Kevin.
Hi, Luke. I appreciate coming on. Thanks very much. I guess for the folks who don't know me, my background is actually in the ministry. For a number of years, I was a Protestant clergyman in Canada. And my family go back to Scotland and Ireland. As a matter of fact, when I began to first pay the price of looking into these genocidal crimes done in Canada, I began to have dreams of my great-grandfather, who was Daniel O'Neill from Tyrone. His whole family died on the coffin ship over to Montreal from County Cork. And he came to me in the dream and he said, this is the same genocide done to our people, right? And, that was an inspiration to me because it made sense the more I looked into this, how it's the same beast we're confronting on both sides of the Atlantic, really, right? And so that leads a lot into what I'm going to be talking about, because about 30 years ago now, I had just taken up a post on the west coast of Canada, a lumber town called Port Alberni. And I began to discover there from Native people themselves how there was a system in place, a lot like in Ireland, but it was run not only by the Catholic Church, but the Anglican Church of England and the church I was in at the time, the United Church, where they'd scoop up children en masse, any Native child, even newborns, they would grab the RCMP, take them into these internment camps they call schools, and use them as slave labor, use them experimentally for trafficking purposes. They even had a death quota, which we learned later. This is all in murderbydecree.com. The churches and government had a certain number of Native people they had to kill off every year. And the average death rate in these places exceeded 50%, and that went on for over half a century.
50%.
And 50%. So to give you some perspective on that, the death rate in Auschwitz and Treblinka and the Nazi death camps was about 25 to 30%, because they were also slave labor camps, right? These were just extermination centers. So we're talking a death rate double that of the concentration camps in Europe during the war. And yet nobody ever called it genocide until we began a campaign about a quarter century ago. I got thrown out of the United Church for surfacing this stuff. They went to my wife and paid for her divorce. I lost custody of my kids. It's what they do to whistleblowers. And, destroy your family, destroy your livelihood. They hope you fall apart. But in fact, it made me even more determined. And I got approached by Native survivors of these places. And over years, we built a big campaign that eventually forced out the truth of this genocide. And yet I got shut out of the media. The more successful we were, they did a whole kind of concealment campaign on this stuff. The usual kind of state and church cover-up that you get in Ireland all the time, like with the Tuam graves and that. Exactly the same process. Create a false narrative, silence the real whistleblowers, the whole bit. But right at that time, around it was 2009 actually, I was visiting relatives in Ireland, and I heard about these folks in Dublin who were holding rallies outside the Dáil, the Doyle, however you pronounce it. I'm sorry, I've forgotten all my Gaelic from centuries ago. Right. Dáil Éireann, yeah. And I made connection with these folks, and we sat around and started talking, and I said to them, the stories you're telling me of what you went through here is exactly what Native people say all the time, exactly the same tortures and, the way the church is basically a law unto itself and is never prosecuted for most of these crimes. So we've set up an international tribunal of crimes of church and state in Dublin in 2010. And it really launched a whole European campaign, which led to common law court cases we brought against Pope Benedict, helped force him and 3 cardinals out of office around 2013, 2014, and really just kind of paved the way to the whole opening up of this international network of child trafficking and murder that goes under the guise and the camouflage of religion. And so it's kind of led me to now we're presently bringing another case against the present Pope Leo, Robert Prevost, from America, because of eyewitnesses who've come forward who've seen him involved in these various cultic ceremonies, which we can describe. But, I often say, Luke, the problem isn't lack of evidence. It's where do you take the evidence? When the government, the courts, the churches, the media, they're all complicit. So we realize we've got to create justice for ourselves. We've got to do our own investigations and put this in the face of these child killers, right?
Yeah, well, I must say, before we get into some of the questions, I do admire your bravery that, well, it's cost you personally, and yet you've carried on and done it anyway. So fair play to you for that. Because, I mean, obviously that tactic of trying to ruin people's lives or threaten them does work to a large extent, but not with everybody. I mean, I have a good friend of mine. She's written this amazing book.
Yeah.
And, people tried to stop her doing this book, The Girl in the Tunnel, about her experiences being underage in a Magdalene laundry at the age of 12, which was actually illegal. And they hid her when important people came round. And, all along, people have tried to shut her up. She's 70 now. Anyway, she succeeded in getting her story out. And, I don't think the threats have probably been as severe as what they've tried to do to you. But even so, you're right. Anybody that sticks their, the head above the parapet you can expect to be attacked. And, it is one of the big problems is finding the right people who you can tell your story to, because if you go to the wrong people, it could be catastrophic, and you could be disappeared. Anything could happen. So, I'm glad that you've managed to get this story out there, and I know you're supporting people in Ireland in continuing to do that work. I think, did you say you'll be coming here at some point later this year? So.
Yeah, actually, in this new court case that's being brought in Brussels by this common law court, we hope convene. It opens on Monday, September 1st, and I want to be there in Europe. I'm assistant to the prosecutor because I've got a lot of evidence. Actually, recently, 4 witnesses, insiders, have come forward with first-hand testimony, and one of them even claims that there's a log in the secret Vatican archives documenting these cult rituals going back to at least 1870, listing all the names of these people, right? So there's some pretty solid evidence coming forward. I'm going to be there working with them, but I'm on speaking tour all over Ireland, England, Scotland. Yeah.
That would be great. And I want to go back in time a little bit. You think about the origins of Christianity. So you had at the beginning, as far as I understand it, a bunch of little small sects which had slightly different beliefs scattered around the Middle East, into North Africa, etc. And then you've got suddenly Constantine comes back from Britain, I think it was, has this huge battle, and then becomes the emperor of the Roman Empire. And at that point, he decides not to become a Christian, but to take over the church. And he has these various meetings. From what I've read, that is basically he got together all the leaders of the church and says, right, you are going to agree to a catechism and a set of beliefs, or you won't get out of here alive, basically.
Right.
Council I don't know if that's correct, but that's the version that I've been told. And I've also read that he was never actually baptized on his deathbed. That was a lie. And he never became a Christian. He was a lifetime follower of Sol Invictus and had no interest in Christianity in itself, only to use it as a political tool to control people. Which makes perfect sense to me. I was wondering what your thoughts are about Constantine, and then what it actually did to the future of Christianity.
Right. Well, I mean, that's accurate. From everything I studied in seminary and since then, it's been a big issue for me because we have to make a distinction between the corporate structure called the church and people's personal beliefs. And, in fact, the Church of Rome and the other churches derived from that they're really the creation of Constantine. They're not linked at all to Jesus Christ in the early Jesus movement, if you like. And one perfect example of that is in the very earliest years of the Christian community in Rome, or anywhere in the Mediterranean world, they had a policy that said, if you're a soldier and you get baptized, you cannot kill anymore. Jesus' most basic teaching is love your enemy, do not strike back, do not kill, right? Then about 80 years later, when Constantine makes the Church of Rome the world's first corporation, right? He makes it an arm of the state. Like you say, he basically statifies it. 180-degree turn. Whoosh, and the Church of Rome's policy becomes that if you are a soldier, you must fight for the emperor. You can love Christ in your heart, but you have to obey the emperor and kill in war. So they make this complete distinction between your faith and your life in the world. It's like the schizophrenic split. And that's an example of it's an arm of the state. And really, I think Roman Catholicism was just kind of a symbiotic Frankenstein monster created, where it was really the Roman Empire with a new Christian logo on it. Perfect example of that, the Bishop of Rome, the so-called Pope, is really just the Roman Emperor. He uses the same title, Pontifex Maximus, the Great Bridge between heaven and earth. Emperor Aurelian and Constantine, that was their official title. All the church symbols, they are usually Roman military symbols. And the title after you're ordained as the Bishop of Rome, it's Vicari Christi, which in Latin means the one who replaces Christ. And that's why there have been so many split-offs from the Church of Rome saying, wait a minute, a man isn't the head of the church, Christ is. So you can't replace that. So a genuine Christian, whether it's the king of the church, King of England, who is head of the Church of England, or the Pope in Rome, they're human substitutes for a spiritual relationship with Christ. And so we say, in that sense, they're anti-Christ. These churches are anti-Christ. And I think that plays out in history. I mean, do the body count. The Church of Rome has killed more people in history in the name of the Prince of Peace. So what does that tell you, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge level of killing all across the world. I suppose it started with Europe and the southern Mediterranean and around there, and it spread from there. I mean, it took a while. I think the last parts of Europe, it took till about 1000 CE before they were finally fell under the threat of invasion. But they've destroyed countless religions and cultures, and then obviously as the discovery of what's called the New World, which is a bit of a ridiculous name really to call it the New World, but as if it didn't exist before it was found.
Well, that violence,
that whole. I was talking to someone about this, about how vast the North and South American continent is together. It reaches all the way from the North Pole down to the bottom of Chile, which is not even far from the Antarctic. So it almost spans the whole longitude of the Earth. And that entire stretch of land has been colonized by the firstly by the Roman Catholic Church, and then some breakaways.
Right.
I mean, you look at what's the abuse that's happened in Ireland, which is utterly horrific. You mentioned the torn babies. That's not the only place. There seem to be maybe another 20 sites around the country, and then you've had all the sales of basically selling them like slaves to be bought by people all across North America.
That's the norm.
The
norm is that, there's a standing policy in the Catholic Church, it's been around since 1929, called crimen solicitanus. It says when children are raped or harmed by a priest, everyone is silenced. No one is to tell the police. And right there, that's a criminal conspiracy. You're protecting child rapists. And if you talk, you're excommunicated, which to a Catholic, it means go to hell. Because God doesn't like you to snitch on child rapists, right? Obviously. So the whole system is it's been violent from the very beginning. And it isn't just violence against, quote, non-believers. Like you mentioned, the early Christian groups, they were persecuted by the Church of Rome and destroyed. One of the things I used to do in church, I would read from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. and the Gospel of Thomas. These were Gnostic Gospels that said there was a secret knowledge. Jesus had a secret wisdom that he imparted only to an inner circle, including Mary, Andrew, and John. And that was burned. You know, they found the remnants of these Gospels in papyrus scrolls in the Near East. But it was like this Church of Rome from the beginning was you believe like us or you're exterminated. And in fact, even recently when Pope Francis went to America, he beatifies, so that's turned into a saint, a guy called Junipero Serra, who was a Franciscan missionary who worked to death over 100,000 native people in California. And Francis, who was touted as a big liberal progressive, said, we are inspired by his zeal. You know, the zeal of murdering 100,000 non-believers. They all still believe this shit, right? But I mean, it's hidden behind all the religious garb so people don't challenge it, right?
Yeah, well, that's shocking. And I wanted to talk a little about South America as well, because the previous Pope has links there to South America, and the new one too.
Yep.
So sometime after all this started to come out in Ireland, I remember it was in the 90s, where my ex-wife is from, was like the epicenter of a scandal in Leinster. You know, the Bishop of Leinster covered us all up. It was particularly a guy called Father Fortune who had just got moved around to different villages and kept abusing people. He eventually killed himself, as did my local priest, who, when he was accused, killed himself. So I wonder if there's an unofficial policy that rather than going to prison or being prosecuted, that these priests are told that they should end themselves rather than go to prison. Is that like some unofficial policy, perhaps? Do you think?
Well, like the mafia. The mafia has the same policy. You've seen that in Godfather movies and that, right? Where the witnesses are told if they take their own life, their family will be taken care of. When I was in Rome, one of the first times, I actually met with a senator called Furio Colombo, and he said, what you have to understand is the church and the mafia and the government and the banks, they're all part of the same club, and they all just care about their money. And they all operate the same way. Like that policy I mentioned, crimen solicitanus, they call it the law of omerta in the mafia, the law of silence. The crime isn't that children are harmed. That isn't a crime in the Catholic Church. It's a sin that they can, quote, forgive. The crime is to talk about it. And it isn't just the Catholics. That's what I was told when I was thrown into the United Church. They said, we know these things are going on about the missing children and all the children who died. The only problem is you wrote a letter about it. I was told that by one of the church officials who threw me out. You're not supposed to talk about the crime. That's the crime.
That's
to talk.
So it was a little bit after I knew the full story about all this stuff, that stuff started to come out a little bit about South America. Maybe about nearly 10 years later that this process began. And there was quite a lot of reports for a while coming out in the world media, and then it just stopped. It just dried up. Right. I guess has the Catholic Church have somehow got on to like Reuters and AP News and all these people and bribed them to like stop reporting on all this same process that's unfolding. Ireland's tiny. Well, do you think about exactly the same thing happening in a continent? The whole of South America is probably like a couple 100 times or 300 times bigger than Ireland is, and it's all across Chile, Argentina, Peru, you name it, Brazil, everywhere.
Well, it's involving big money too, because the Vatican Bank is a lot of its assets are going towards China. There's a big shift east because most of the economic power in the world is now in Asia, and the economic growth and everything. China's the rising superpower. China's the only country in the world where the government gets to appoint Catholic bishops and cardinals along with the church. They got this little kind of arrangement. And what they're after are the resources of the Western Hemisphere. Pope Francis signed a deal when he was in Canada in 2022 to underwrite Chinese takeover of North America, the infrastructure, the roads, the highways, all the resources, the oil and gas and the liquid natural gas in the north of Canada, the uranium. They're buying it all up with Vatican Bank underwriting to almost $1 trillion every year. Same thing in South America. The present guy who's in, Pope Leo, his archbishopric was on the northwest coast of Peru at the major port where the Chinese ships are coming in and sucking out all the minerals from South America. These guys are like business
Oh,
partners
wow.
of
No,
Beijing.
no, that's news to me. I mean, I've
Yeah,
known about the corruption in the Vatican Bank going back a long time,
yeah,
links with like the Club of Rome and all these kind of things.
yeah.
And then mafia ties, and obviously what happened in World War II with the, the, the regime there and their money.
Yeah.
And it seems they knew about various actions. The Holocaust, Zyklon B, that was actually there was a German officer who went to Rome and basically reported it was on his conscience. There's a film about it which is banned in Europe called Amen, which tells you all about that. But I actually got a copy from the States. I think
Well, it
it
gets,
was.
Luke, it
Because you
gets
can't
even,
buy it here. You can't even buy it.
yeah,
Um,
it's a lot worse. The Vatican actually ran the third largest extermination camp in Europe, in Croatia. It was aimed at the Serbs because they weren't Catholics, and about 1 million Serbs were killed in this Jasenovac death camp, run by a Franciscan bishop called Ivan Saric. And I've met survivors there when I was in former Yugoslavia giving talks, and it was run directly by Pope Innocent XII, or Pius XII, so-called Pius XII, who recognized Hitler. It was the first power in the world to recognize Hitler. They ran the death camp to wipe out the Serbs because they weren't Catholics. I mean, and this stuff was buried after the war because the Vatican used their rat lines to bring a lot of the Nazis to North and South America. But it's right there, all the evidence. But,
yeah,
these guys are
suppressed. Yeah.
open murder,
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It's just beggars belief. So I wanted to ask your opinion about two people. One of them being the new Pope Leo, and the other about a former Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, who was excommunicated some time ago. He's talked openly about Satanism in the Vatican and corruption. And of course, like, he was denounced by Francis and already excommunicated, but now you have this new guy, Leo, and he doesn't have anything good to say about him either. So
No.
I'm wondering what your opinion is about him. And I'm amazed that he hasn't been silenced by the church. I'm amazed he's still alive, to be honest. But what's your opinion about him, and also about Leo, the new pope?
Well, starting with Leo, Robert Prevost, they're touting him as the first American pope. In fact, in the College of Cardinals, he's referred to as the second Latin American pope because although he was born in Chicago, at a young age, right after ordination, he went off to South America. He's got dual citizenship. He's Peruvian and American. And he started working, as a missionary with this Augustinian order who had a long history of the usual kind of genocidal activities in that part of the world. But early on, he became an archbishop. He was part of this network that operates within the Catholic Church. The evidence suggests that the Jesuits set it up in the 1500s as a way to politically control popes and cardinals. And it's a sacrificial ceremony based on early Roman rituals where children and animals that were routinely sacrificed. And we've had two eyewitnesses, two women who were quite aged, but they say they were present at the ceremony the same month that, do you remember John Paul I, another kind of Vigano reformer? He got killed after 28 days in office. They poisoned him because he was investigating the mob and Masonic connections with the Vatican Bank. And he was found dead in bed. All of his associates were all dead within a year. Car bombs, assassinations, The magistrates investigating, they got blown up. So, it was a clear kind of Vatican inside job, right? But this German woman said she was present at a ceremony under the Vatican grottos. Like, this is under St. Peter's Square, this whole early Christian catacomb system under there. She says she saw him and the former Pope John Paul II, who took over from the guy they killed, at a ceremony where a 4-year-old boy was sacrificed. And these aren't just sacrificial rituals. They're cannibalistic. They're based on the Latin Mass. that believes you're eating the literal body of Christ and drinking his blood. And it's a cannibalistic ritual, right?
Yeah.
She said Robert Prevost took his vows, and it's true, in September 78, he took his vows as a priest. And then he took a parallel vow to the Ninth Circle, which is what it's called. And when you do that at a young age, you go on a red list. These are future candidates who can become pope. If you don't go along with it, you're on a blacklist, and like me, you get tossed out or just ignored. So you can't rise up through the church hierarchy without knowing about this stuff. It's a very controlled kind of network. And so the Ninth Circle refers to Dante's poem called the Inferno, where the ninth level of hell was where Satan resides, along with anyone who betrays a sacred trust, like the trust of a child, right? And
I was going to ask you more about that. So do you know much of the history of this sort of sub-organization within the church?
You mean the Ninth Circle?
How it started and what its actual purpose is, other than obviously weeding out good people who they can't control.
Right. Well, it's a number of things. I believe that these people are literally get an energetic high off doing this. It's like any addiction. It grows, and it has to be fed all the time. It's very lucrative. Child trafficking and these networks make a lot of money. The Catholic Church has made billions off trafficking children. Former Pope Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, did it in Argentina during the military junta. They did it in Spain under the Franco dictatorship. They take the children of political prisoners and traffic them for a lot of money. And one of the judges who works with us tried to bring a case against that in Spain. He got thrown right off the bench for trying to do it. So it's kind of a long tradition, very embedded in European politics, right? It involves royal family members in England, Holland, Belgium. We've had Toos Nienhuis. She was a witness who came forward. She was born into this cult and was a survivor of it. So it goes back at least to the time of the Jesuits, although Dante, when he wrote that poem in the 13th century, he was an insider in the Vatican, and I believe he was describing literal events.
Wow.
I think don't forget, these are Roman rituals. These date back thousands of years to Rome, like everything else in the Catholic Church. So it's all of those things. People claim that satanic entities are present during these things. It depends. I think it's all of the above.
Very likely.
Yeah.
Sounds very similar to like the actual satanic black mass, which is, what actual Satanists do. So It sounds very similar indeed. I mean, we do know that the pagan Romans were still sacrificing animals. That it was said that by the time of Constantine they'd long stopped human sacrifice, and we know they did in sort of during the Republic times. So maybe they were continuing to do that in secret anyway.
Yeah, these things never stop. I mean, when you think about one of the ways that a few people control many people is you traumatize them at a young age. That's why child rape is not in practice a crime under the law. There's wrist slapping for raping and trafficking children. And that's because it's a tool of state and church. It's a way to keep people traumatized and in line. If that happens to you at a young age, the last thing you want to do is challenge authority, let alone expose these crimes, right? So it's a political weapon as well that's used against everybody, right?
Yeah. I want to go back to something about, you mentioned the royal family of Britain. Before we get to that, what's your feeling about Archbishop Carlo Mario Vigano?
Right. I think I've never met him. I read contending things about him. I think anyone within the church who comes forward and challenges things, needs to be supported. I mean, we need to build a broad alliance across all religious and political grounds on this. The basic thing of having to protect children and stopping church policies and actions which allow them to operate as a law unto themselves. And don't forget, but we're living in a time of like another Reformation. I mean, there's big movements breaking off from the church. When I was in Ireland the first time, there was a group of priests I met who had all left. And I know in Quebec and France, in Canada, I've met Catholic priests who've done the same thing. They said, okay, we're going to have our own congregation. We're not going to send money to Rome. We don't recognize the Pope as the head of the church. Christ is. So, it's like pulling another Martin Luther, but on a different level now because it's global, and it's involving crimes against humanity.
Yeah,
Should
absolutely.
not be tolerated, right?
Yeah, it's. I think he's mentioned Satan being in the Vatican, and
Right.
but he hasn't actually gone into specific details in the way that you just mentioned before. I suppose he's in a position where he can't do that, and he might accidentally sort of fall down a hole or crash his car into a wall or something if he were to be too overt about his dissent. I
Well,
maybe
I don't know.
somehow allowed him to carry on being a dissenter, but
Right.
only if he goes so far.
Right.
Perhaps
That's
if he
right.
steps the line, he might suddenly have an accident.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're accurate there, Luke, because people make deals. When you're an insider like that, don't forget, having been an archbishop, he knew exactly what was going on about all this stuff, and he was complicit in it. So obviously, I think he was approached and said, "Okay, you can talk about this, this, and this, but not this." And it's controlled opposition. The church is good at doing that. There's a group in America called SNAP, which is organizing victims of the church. But in fact, SNAP was set up in the 1990s by the Catholic Church in Chicago, the archdiocese there, where the present pope came out of, Robert Prevost. And it was a front group. And we saw the same thing in Canada and Ireland. Survivors who are willing to work with the government and church and not raise certain issues, they get money, they get media coverage, they get official recognition. But survivors like your friend who wrote that book, who are, quote, loose cannons, who are willing to talk about anything, people like me, we get ostracized, shunned, blacklisted. The smear campaign is massive about us. So
Imagine, yeah.
it's like an octopus. It's got its tentacles and it tries to control all the opposition. So I think, yeah, Vigano is likely to be more than that. Otherwise, well, people ask me, why am I still walking around? If you get a lot of exposure, it's not in their interest to kill off people like me and make martyrs, because that brings more attention. You want to just discredit and try to scare people about the name or the issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. If they can just badmouth you and make you look
Right. It's better.
bad or destroy your credibility in some way, that's a lot easier than having to actually dispose of somebody in many ways. So
That's right. And about all this stuff.
they missed the boat there. I think it's already too late for them to sort of
Right.
unalive you really now, because like you've got a name, and the people all over the place would be questioning if you suddenly
Right.
something weird happened to you. They would be very
Yeah,
suspicious.
if they haven't killed me before now, and with all the work I was doing in Canada and forcing out Pope Benedict and all that, they're not going to do it now. It'd be too obvious. But don't forget also, when you're doing the right thing, you do have a kind of unknown protection around you.
Yeah.
I've seen that work all the time. And I just keep trusting that, keep going. And that's, where the support comes from as well. I wanted to mention this book, too, on Amazon people can get. It goes into great detail about the nature of the Vatican, how it's a criminal body laundering money for the mob, one of the biggest investors in the arms industry and in big pharma. And we sold over 1,200 copies of this in the last month. People are really
That's fantastic.
interested now. Yeah.
Well, I will put a description for that where you can get it into the
Thank
underneath the video and the description. I'll put a link for that.
Okay.
Okay. So, I wanted to go back a little bit. The British royal family have been implicated. I can remember, I think it was, you may have heard of a man called David Icke,
Yep.
who mentioned this. He mentioned all the scandalous goings on in Canada with the Native American people, and he implicated the British royal family, and particularly Elizabeth II. But there was mentions of lizard people and such like. So a lot of people dismissed it as pure rubbish. At the time, I was thinking, oh, this sounds a bit too much. But it turns out, at least as far as their involvement in the indigenous people of North America and Canada, he was absolutely right. So, but that was a long time ago that he came out with this. So,
Right. Well, actually, he kind of, took that from us because we're the ones who broke that story. It was about a man called William Coombs who worked with our network in Canada. And when William was a young boy at the Kamloops Catholic death camp in British Columbia, he saw Queen Elizabeth and Philip show up October 10th, 1964. They were on a, quote, royal visit at that time, so it was confirmed. He saw Elizabeth take 10 children away, and they're never seen again, 7 boys and 3 girls. All the numbers add up to 10, October 10th, 1964. It definitely a cultic kind of activity. And after the fact, when William was about to go public with that, the Mounties picked him up, took him into the Catholic St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver, and he was dead within 48 hours. The nurse said he had all the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, the blackened fingernails. He had no signs of tuberculosis, which was the official cause of death, tubercular meningitis. So they killed him before he could give testimony. Now, subsequently, we got a communique from somebody who used to be in Charles's security retinue, working with a guy called Major Johnny Thompson, who's still in there. And he said that the kill order came from Charles. And we subpoenaed both of them, Elizabeth and Charles, to respond to these things. They never contested it, which is an admission of guilt under the law, because you're not challenging what's being said about you, right? And so that story then broke all over the world, and I guess David Icke picked it up. And people quote it now without saying the source is the work we were doing in Canada that led to this first common law court trial that forced Ratzinger out of office.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, so obviously the former Queen Elizabeth II will never be accountable for any of this, but because she's gone. But I'm wondering, is there anything can ever be done to make the current king accountable for what happened? Is there anything in progress, or that be an impossibility?
A lot's been happening. The last 10 or 12 years in the world where you're seeing all of this stuff coming out about high-level involvement in child killing and trafficking, it's all because of initiatives that we began in Canada, but other people picked up all over the world. It was like a catalyst. So when you look at the long view, a lot is changing, and yet they continually try to fog it, misdirect it, put in false stories, like what's going on right now, in Ireland over all the discoveries of these same kind of mass graves of children. But the present so-called King Charles, he's on the hot seat. First of all, he's not a very popular guy, but there's a whole movement in England now, and it's one of the reasons I'm going to speak there. People are trying to set up a republic in England, and it's got a real shot of the arm because of all these revelations about Charles, right? They're saying, why should we live under the rule of a convicted criminal institution like the British Crown? And that's the thing. Under international law, when heads of state are convicted of these crimes, they've lost their authority. That's what prompted the movement to set up a republic in Canada in 2015, the Republic of Canada. It came out of all this work because we realized we need a new arrangement now where criminals can't hide behind, unaccountable offices like that. So I think it is sowed a lot of good seeds that are beginning to sprout up. People just have to be aware and then act on that knowledge. And that's knowledge of this. We mentioned William. This is that's William, when we did some of our first protests. And when we occupied the Anglican Church office in Vancouver, that's him speaking to the TV cameras about what he had witnessed. He was so happy when he was doing this because, when we began to occupy churches, he was too afraid to go near a Catholic church. The sound of a church bell would make him physically ill because the priest would put him on a rack, stretch him on a rack, and anally rape him with electric cattle prods. And he couldn't go near a church. But the day we occupied that church together, there was William right inside with us, handing out flowers with a big smile on his face. Right. And I couldn't understand. He said, I didn't want to let you all down, right? And I realized the strength we get from each other. It can overcome our individual weaknesses. And that's why I always say to people, do things together, confront these people head on, and you lose your fear. He said after, I saw these priests were just cowards. And in fact, these priests ran out the back of the church when we walked in with our banner, right? And the same thing happened. My friend Mary Kelly did that in Pro Cathedral in Dublin. She got up and she started from the pulpit, talking about this Vatican policy of protecting child rape. The priest takes off out the back door because they know they're all guilty, right? So it gives you a great weapon, a great lever in a situation, even though there are not many of you, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've known a few people that were training as priests.
Yeah.
You probably heard of Maynooth, which is was like a very busy seminary. Now it's just a regular university with the
Mm.
old part. No, that basically nobody wants to be a priest anymore, at least not in Ireland.
No.
But what has amazed me is, how few people actually came forward during the process of becoming a curate. How few
Mm.
people walked away. I know a few people who walked away from it and they were horrified by uh, the abuse and some of the sexual practices and the sort of steering people in a certain direction. I suppose you don't actually, they won't let you become a priest if they think you can't be corrupted at all, I suppose. Would that be right?
Yeah, there's a whole weeding out process. It's more blatant in the Church of Rome because they've had such a long history doing this, and they're so unaccountable. They're like the Vatican Bank. It's a secret society. You can't know who the directors are. It can't be audited. So behind that secrecy, all sorts of crime and evil can flourish.
Yeah.
And they have to weed out any troublemaker from the beginning for that reason. And I experienced that even in, a relatively small Protestant church I was in Canada. Early on, the first month I got to Port Alberni, an older minister took me aside and he said, working on Vancouver Island, you should know that it's easy to get children here. And I kind of looked at him oddly, like, what are you talking about, get children? And it was a test. He was fishing, right? And then he said, oh, no, nothing. Just thought I should mention, and he moved on. So they test people to see if you're interested, and then you're taken in, right? And blackmailed. And so, that happens everywhere, right? And it's right under our noses.
Yeah, of course, the blackmailing is something that the church actually has in common with satanic organizations, official satanic. They get you to do things, but they also blackmail you afterwards so that you can't leave or rat on them, so there's actually a tremendous amount of overlaps there between actual bona fide Satanism and some of these things that are going on behind the scenes in the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, I think they're really the same.
Some of these Protestant churches too. It's shocking.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable, really.
Yeah, it's like in political parties, there's no distinction on this when it comes to or churches. But that's exactly the process they used in the Ninth Circle as well. We had two eyewitnesses, Anne-Marie van Bienberg and Toos van Nienhaus, and they both said the same thing. They had been lured in. Anne-Marie was a lawyer who was invited to a dinner. Next thing she knows, she walks into a room and there's an altar with a kid on it, and everything's being filmed. So at that point, they've got people. They can trap them. They entrap judges. They work with the European mafia. They call it the Drangheta, who provide children for human hunting parties to cardinals and bishops all over Europe. Carnarvon Castle in Wales is the site of one of these things, where Charles got inaugurated as the Prince of Wales. It always involves one of these ceremonies. So I think Catholicism and Satanism are very parallel bodies, and they mutual partners.
Really, really tragic. It's shocking that that how under our noses for so long has an organization that's supposed to be the representative of Jesus.
Well, that's the thing.
Christ he has gotten away with this for centuries, possibly well over 1,000 years. It's hard to believe that this could actually happen.
Christ has no representative. That's the point. I mean, he says himself, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am. He doesn't say you have to be an ordained priest. He doesn't even talk about the church, right? Or any of that. So, I mean, that's the thing. People go back to Bible and read it, and they've got their answers there. But that's why the church burned Bibles for so many centuries, because it was refuting, and it still does. It refutes everything the Church of Rome is saying, right?
Well, I suppose that's why, when the printing press was used to produce non-Latin Bibles,
right,
it tried to suppress it. But I mean, even if you're not a Christian at all, or even if you don't believe in God at all, because
Mm.
there's obviously many people of different faiths and atheists too. The whole thing is so about faith, such a contradiction that
Yep.
it's, I mean, utterly shocking to anyone with even a small shred of humanity can just see how utterly corrupt and wrong and evil such a thing is. Um,
Yep.
I'm still amazed that it could have gone on so long and undetected until relatively recently. It's really only since the 90s. Actually, it's odd that actually it's really Ireland that this really erupted, the whole thing. It's been going on all over the world, but has been kind of bottled up and suppressed. But it, from what I know, it's really Ireland where it sort of erupted like a boil that just was unstoppable. Uh,
Right.
Maybe that's because this was such a I suppose subjugated, totally Catholic country, and has been for a very very long time. Um, I don't know if you're aware, but there was a holy war declared in I think it was 1585 when the Pope at the time sent one of his envoys along with a small mercenary force, and they landed in Dingle, and their purpose was to kick off this huge war
Mm.
as a war against England, particularly because it had a Protestant queen, and they didn't actually care about who was running Ireland. What the church cared about was eradicating um, Protestantism via Ireland, so it's a backdoor entry into sort of
Right.
attacking,
Right.
because obviously they'd sanctioned the Armada, which failed against Philip II, basically ruined
Hmm.
Spain trying to do that, um, and then this was another attempt to sort of create a huge uprising, and of course they attempted to assassinate her, and I think
Oh
they
yeah.
assassinated some Protestant monarchs in the continent quite successfully, but they failed to kill her off, I think.
Right. Well, that's why, right in that same period, that's why the Jesuits were set up, a military society under Ignatius Loyola, the Spanish mercenary soldier. And they took a special oath to the Bishop of Rome saying, we'll kill any enemy of the church. And their first target was Elizabeth. In fact, my name, Annett, we were French Huguenots who had to flee France after they killed about 20,000 of us in one night,
Mm.
and an
Wow.
order right out of the Vatican to kill off as many Huguenots as possible. And in our family, we still call her Good Queen Bess because she gave sanctuary to all the European Protestants. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean,
it's
yeah,
funny.
it helps, right?
She's hated here, and there was carnage and terrible slaughter in the Elizabethan wars.
Uh,
The 9 Years' War was pretty brutal, and it ended with
right,
the defeat of Ireland, and then she sort of recouped all this money she'd spent. I think she
right,
spent an incredible £2 million on her campaign to sort of take over Ireland to secure her own throne. It was really without. But she's not well liked here, obviously because of that and the
no.
suppression of Catholicism. But then
Well,
people
then they,
don't realize about the campaign. The other way was to try to annihilate
right,
Reformation completely and
yeah,
murder anyone who was Protestant. Because I think at the beginning of her reign, she permitted freedom of religion and then had
yeah.
to change it because everyone was trying to kill her.
Well,
So,
that's right. It was an act of state to every Catholic had taken a personal oath, like they still do,
mm,
personal oath of loyalty to one man in Rome. That makes every English person who's a Catholic a potential fifth columnist, and she knew that. She was very
yeah,
smart politically, right? But monarchs are all the same, whether they're called popes or kings. They're trying to become God, and
yeah,
that's why a lot of my ancestors came to America to say we got to start a society not based on single rulers, but the people ruling themselves, right?
yeah. Well, I'm under no illusions that she
Yeah,
was a great person. I mean, like all monarchs, as you say, she was
right.
interested in money and power, and
Yeah,
you know, uh, bloodlust was very common amongst, probably all of the British monarchy, going right back, it would seem. So, but I wanted to move on to more modern times again.
right.
Um, the current Pope has been referred to as the Black Pope, and you're probably aware of his prophecies about, I forget the name of this monk who made these prophecies about a list of popes and who they would be, and the final Pope being this Black Pope. Some people have suggested that he is the Black Pope, but not in terms of his actual racial characteristics or his skin color, but being a Black Pope as in satanic. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, again, these stories are generated usually by the church themselves because, like we talked about controlled opposition before, you have to create the appearance that, well, the church is basically good, and then there's bad elements within it, like the bad apples theory. The institution isn't bad, just there's bad elements in it, and which is a lie when you look at it in history. These things can only happen because the entire institution is backing it, right? But the Black Pope was referred to the Jesuits because there's factions within the church that didn't like the Jesuits. Like the reason they wiped out the Templars in the 14th century, because they had the Templars in Europe had a lot of money. They created the first banks. And so the King of France and the Pope wiped them all out in 1302, I think, and to get their money. And, you know, the same deal. They're saying these faction fights still going on in the Vatican, right?
They were burned as heretics, most of them. And then there's accusations that they were followers of Baphomet. I mean, I'm wondering if that was all concocted.
Part of the smear campaign, right. You know, but the point is, in terms of now, the circulating these lies about Black Pope, White Pope, whatever, the point is that if the Jesuit, one of the guys who we forced out of office, there was Ratzinger himself, and in the wake of that, about a year after that, Cardinal Sean Brady in Ireland, because of his cover-up of the Tuam mass grave, the Secretary of State at the time, and Adolfo Pichon, who was head of the Jesuits, they all stepped down. In fact, we issued an order against Pichon to step down because of his direct implication in the child trafficking. 30 days later, he did. Now, again, that was all concealed by the corporate media. But the point is that
it shows. I never heard of that. I never heard anything about it. Yeah.
No, in fact, I did a ceremony outside, not only the one in Vatican. I did this exorcism there in 2009 where the tornado hit the next morning, and then the stuff breaks in the European press. But then I did another one outside Maastricht, Holland, the oldest Catholic church outside Rome, and we posted notice of notifying the Jesuits that he had to step down or face prosecution. 30 days later, he's announced his resignation. So, I mean, I don't think these things are coincidence, but they always put in cover stories and make it look like it wasn't because they were exposed, it's because they had health issues or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Whatever people want to believe. But no, so you got to take it with a grain of salt, these stories and these legends of the last Pope. The point is the Pope has no authority. It's a Santa Claus reality, you know, that people believe in, but it doesn't have any basis in law or fact. He's just a figurehead. And the real
he's
power,
just the front man then, really. The whole organization, you know.
Follow the money.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, I've wondered about this, the future of the church. I mean, obviously Christianity will continue, but do you think the Roman Catholic Church and all these other churches who are involved in these outrageous, heinous crimes, are they doomed? Do you think? I mean, obviously the church itself has an enormous amount of land, huge amount of money, massive resources. Do you see it ever collapsing? Would you say it's doomed, or is it going to somehow mutate and survive? What do you think?
Well, it is collapsing. You know, it's collapsing from the inside out. And not only because people are leaving it and are very aware in this day and age of these crimes and everything, but they're smart enough to know that, you know, some guy with a funny hat that has nothing to do with Jesus Christ, right? Either historically or spiritually in any other way. Like, I've never believed that Roman Catholicism is Christianity. I think it was built on the dead bones of the murdered Christian church. And so to me, it's not even an issue. Their corporate structure will continue for a long time because it's got money and power in that. But even that's been challenged. Like in Canada and other countries like Chile, indigenous people have taken over and sacked Catholic churches. They banished them from their land. They're reclaiming their property and assets. All of that in that book I showed you, this was addressed to people in the UN saying the Vatican's got to lose its status as an observer state at the UN, as a criminal society, and needs to be prosecuted. Every government in the world today could help disestablish the Church of Rome. And, we've got to encourage movements in that direction at every level, right? Because it's an unaccountable criminal body that's a direct threat to the lives and liberties of people, especially children, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing. I've read quite a lot about the history of the church. And, I remember working in this publishing company, and we used to get books come in from all over the place. And one of the books I got to read was called The Sex Lives of the Popes, which is goes into the Borgias, but it goes into a lot of other shocking stuff. And, you look at this and you think, oh, wow, my gosh, it was pretty scandalous. But this is all like hundreds of years ago. But then you realize actually now that nothing's really changed. So they've just tried to put a smokescreen across it all. So, that was the ancient past. That was, that was the Renaissance period. Things are very different now, but it would appear that they're not any different than they were back then.
Well, the whole celibate thing didn't come in until the 1500s in the Counter-Reformation. Yeah. There was no celibacy before the 16th century, and they did it partly because there were so many illegitimate children of popes and cardinals running around. They were all claim to the Vatican wealth, right? And they have to kind of get rid of that possibility. It's always about the wealth and the power, right? Yeah. And they wanted to look more, in response to the Reformation, the church was doing a house cleaning, and to make it look like, we're all celibate, saintly men here, right? Which is crap. All the priests I've ever known, not one of them is celibate. I mean, it's just this fiction for the people in the pews, right?
Right, yeah. It's just theatre then, really, for the masses, yeah. Well, you could say, a lot of people would say that religion has always been theatre for the masses of whatever variety you choose. But
totally.
I suppose that would explain so much about why they are so opposed to Gnosticism. I suppose all religions tend to be that way. They don't want people to have a direct connection with whatever they perceive God to be.
Exactly right.
It makes them superfluous. There's no need for them. You don't need the middleman if you can go direct to the source.
Yeah.
Which would make that makes perfect sense from an ordinary person's point of view who wishes to have a spiritual life. If you don't need an intermediary, then why bother with one? And of course, that also involves money as well, doesn't it? I mean, I can remember, always having to bring some change, at least if I went to mass, or if I didn't remember to bring some money, like a note or some coins, you'd be horribly embarrassed. And if you didn't put anything into the plate. And someone was telling me, a friend of mine who was a bit older, about when he was a kid, they used to read out the donations. And if you given, like, say, I don't know, 50p, the priest would read it out in a sort of very angry, humiliating voice, sort of like, I don't know, be like, Brian O'Donnell, 50 pence.
Oh, it's so disgusting.
And then there'd be like, Vice Admiral Har, £28. Oh, very wonderful. And then the people that gave a tiny amount, it would be, it was punts rather than pounds, but you get the point. So they used to actually humiliate people.
Oh, yeah.
To force you to give more money back in the day by reading out all the donations. And it's just like, I guess
they didn't read the part where Jesus said you cannot serve God and money.
No, they obviously didn't, no. But then you see that in a lot of churches, even today, especially, I suppose, the evangelicals are on the TV.
Oh, yeah.
They're all like, I need a Cadillac. Jesus wants me to have a Cadillac. give generously.
Well, yeah. In my church, we did away with the collection, and the collection played. There was a box at the back, and I said, because a lot of the poor people were coming down. I'm not going to soak poor people to come to church. I said, if you support what we're doing, there's a box at the back, donate anonymously, whatever. But this whole ritual of bringing the plate forward and saying a prayer over it, I mean, it's kind of idolatrous. What are we doing? Worshiping money in the collection plate on the altar? I mean, like, it's stupid, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. Yeah. But I suppose that's the thing. Organizations require money to run. And so you've always got this sort of conflict between the spiritual life and the actual desire to, accumulate wealth.
Well, as a matter of fact, Luke, most of the campaigning I've ever done has been with a lot of poor homeless people. And look what we achieved. We
Yeah.
moved Canada to admit to genocide. We helped force out a pope. You make up for lack of money by people on the ground working together. And the more people you have working together, the less you need that stuff. So,
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
yeah.
That's
That's how you
fantastic.
avoid that trap, right?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to ask you, so what are you hoping to achieve when you come over? You're obviously going to be part of this trial, and then you said you're also coming to Ireland. So going forward, what are your hopes for the coming year and into maybe next year too?
Well, I'm building on a lot of the momentum we have of the new evidence on this present Robert Prevost, Pope Leo. And also, I turned 70 in February, and I've been at this for over 30 years. I'm looking to, like an elder does, pass on knowledge and campaigning to younger lives of people who will carry this on, because 20, 30 years from now, they're the ones who are going to have to continue this fight. It's not going to end overnight. This battle is ongoing. It has to do with, I think, the tyranny descending on all of us. So we need to activate people all over the place, especially to set up their own common law courts and local assemblies where they can pass their own laws, take back power in their community. I mean, that's ultimately the only guarantee we have that these crimes are going to stop. Otherwise, you're dependent on the system that's enabling the crime, right? And so I want to encourage all of that, and also meet good people. It's what keeps me going. People on the ground. There's so many well-intentioned people, goodwill people, but we have to turn the goodwill into good action, and that's what I want to.
Absolutely. And even today, there's still so many people who don't know about this stuff, who wrongly assume that the church is a good organization that is doing more good than harm. And I think most people, when they actually know the truth, when they realize, they're absolutely horrified. But there's still a lot of people out there that need to be reached, to be educated about what's actually really going on, and not this facade that they've been presenting to the world for all this time. So that's fantastic. You're continuing to do all this. And I hope that other people, as you say, who are just coming up, who are young, who are in their 20s, 30s, or whatever, will join this fight and continue it. Ultimately, I think, the church is going to be doomed. It has to eventually disappear, because I think we will enter a time where people will want a direct connection with deity of God, or whatever you want to call it, instead of it being through an intermediary, through this middleman.
Right.
I think, as you say, it might take some years, maybe several decades before we get there. So I guess it's a fight that has to be continued, because in the absence of actually taking action, they'll continue to do heinous and evil things,
especially since the Vatican was the whole model of the whole corporate system we got now. This hierarchy, and with the rising Chinese power, what I call the corporatocracy in the world, where it's not governments, but, big corporate conglomerates dictating everything. We saw that during the whole COVID fiasco thing, right? So I think we need to realize we got to get out of that corporate system, and the Vatican is the embodiment of it, right? They've been keeping it going all these centuries. So, like you say, people take power, rule in their own name. No intermediaries. We don't need them, right? We can govern ourselves, right?
Before we go, do you want to share with people, how they can get in touch with you, maybe your website, etc.? Where, I'm sure there's people who may need to get in touch. You have got things to tell you, things to report, and
especially folks in Ireland, because I always have a soft spot whenever I go home to where the land of my ancestors. So I want to especially try to book in gigs in Ireland, but all over England as well, and Western Europe where I'm booked in. Angelfire101@protonmail.com. That's my email. Murderbydecree.com, where you can see a lot of my books and all our work, all the evidence of what we've been talking about. And republicofcanada.org. That's our republic in Canada, Kanata, Canada, republicofcanada.org. And, all my books are up on Amazon.com and, or just write me.
Great. Well, I'm going to put those links into the description as well that you've just mentioned. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to come and talk to me. And thank you for your honesty and transparency and just being very upfront about all this. It's not an easy thing to talk about, and it's very shocking. So I really appreciate your taking the time to come and talk about this today. So
anytime, Luke. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye for now.